Hello and welcome to Straight Onto Disney, a Disney deep dive and analysis podcast, where each week I, your host Jonathan, takes a deep dive into the history of each Disney film and the legacy that they left behind. I'd like to remind you that you can follow me on Instagram at StraightOntoDisneyPod, and you can email your thoughts at straightontodisneypod@gmail.com. Hello and welcome to this week's Straight Onto Disney Pod, where we're going to be chatting all things Peter Pan. So that means we're off to Neverland. But before we start, there's always a little bit of mousekeeping, and this week's mousekeeping is quite tiny, so it's not going to take us too long as last week's. The Devil Wears Prada 2 releases in theatres on May 1st, and that's really it. Like, in major news, there's small little construction-y things, there's a few small construction things that have been going on, but ultimately not like major news that we can dive into and discuss. So we're going to move straight on to the film. Peter Pan was released in 1953 and was directed by Hamilton Luske, Clyde Geronimi, and Wilfred Jackson. The film was produced by Walt Disney. The film was written by Milt Banter, William Cottrell, Winston Hibler, Bill Peet, Erdman Penner, Joe Rinaldi, Ted Sears, and Ralph Wright. The film's story was by Ted Sears, Erdman Penner, Bill Peet, Winston Hibler, Joe Rinaldi, Mil Banter, Ralph Wright, and Bill Cottrell. The film was edited by Donald Halliday. Music was by Oliver Wallace. The film stars Bobby Driscoll as Peter Pan, Catherine Beaumont as Wendy Darling, Hans Conrad as Captain Hook and George Darling, Bill Thompson as Mr. Smee and the Pirates, Heather Angel as Mary Darling, Paul Collins as John Darling, Tommy Luske as Michael Darling, Candy Candido as the Indian Chief, and Tom Conway as the narrator. Uncredited includes Stuffy Singer as Slightly, Johnny McGovern as the twins, Robert Ellis as Cubby, Jeffrey Silver as Nibs, Jimmy Buffalo as the Lost Boys singing voices, Clarice Nash as Nana, Foray, Connie Hilton, Karen Kester, and Margaret Kerry as the mermaids. Foray also voiced the Squaw Woman. Glenn Wood and Thury Ravenscroft as the chorus. The Melloman as the singing pirates swinging Indians. Studios was Walt Disney Productions. Its distributor was RKO Radio Pictures. The film was released February 5th, 1953, with a running time of 78 minutes. The film was released in English and had a budget of $4 million. Peter Pan is the 1953 American animated musical fantasy adventure film that is based on the play Peter Pan or the Boy Who Would Never Grow Up by J.M. Barrie, and which makes this the 14th film in the Disney animated canon. Peter Pan would be the final Disney animated feature to be released through RKO. Peter Pan would be the final Disney film to be released through RKO. Future animated pictures would be released by the Walt Disney's own distribution. Future films would be distributed by Walt Disney's own production company. Let me get this right. Peter Pan would be the final Disney film. Peter Pan would be the final Disney animated feature to be released through RKO Pictures. Future animated features would be released by Walt Disney's own company, Buena Vista Film Distribution. It is also the final Disney film in which all of the members of the God, I can't get this right. Right. It is also the final Disney film in which all of the main members of Disney's Nine Old Men. It would also be the final Disney film in which all members of Disney's 9 Old Men would work together as directing animators. The film was entered into the 1953 Cannes Film Festival. A sequel titled Return to Neverland was released in 2003, and a series of direct-to-DVD prequels focusing on Tinkerbell were released starting with 2008. A Disney Junior television series featuring some of the characters from Jake and the Neverland Pirates premiered in 2011. Whilst not a big hit at first, despite not being a big hit at first, it is now considered one of Disney's most beloved classics of all time. In 2023, a live-action adaptation of the film was released on Disney Plus. And to be honest, that live action, I'm like, it's an okay live action Disney film, but if I'm going to be truthfully honest, I haven't really watched it properly, and I know a lot of consensus is it's not great from Disney fans that I've tried to, and no, so it's going to be an interesting one when we do dive into that later on, and in this episode, I'll think of things as well. In this episode, I'll mention things. To be honest, a lot of my live action. The thing with Peter Pan is Peter Pan's had so many live action adaptations outside of the Disney that sometimes you're like, I think they were better live action adaptations and did something unique and different compared to the live action Disney film. Right. So, what's interesting is that Disney's history with Peter Pan goes back a long way, quite like Alice in Wonderland did to his childhood, as in 1913, Walt Disney saw a touring play. So a touring play. Oh, it's gone tiny. Hang on, this is ridiculous that I can't change the font size on here. 1 minute. Right. Get out. Just go small. Because I'm sorry, but this is ridiculous. Thank you. Let's see how that looks. It's still tiny. That's it. Right. Hang on a minute. I'm just going to go back to the top. Here we are. Just going to make it like 30 or something. So it's going to be. The problem is my phone. I'm just testing something. Right, that's readable. Oh. Because if I sat there, took your Walt Disney, to be fair, I'll just make it a tad bit bigger. Right, one. Scroll. Because I don't need any of that. Right. Go even bigger. What are we on? 27. So that I did that. Because obviously I'm gonna do. Boom. Right. We're gonna do that bit again. In 1913, Walt Disney do. So, quite like Alice in Wonderland, Walt Disney's history with Peter Pan stems quite a way back to his childhood. As in 1913, he would go and see a touring production at Carter Opera House, starring Maud Adams as Peter Pan. In in Marceline. At Park School, Walt played Peter Pan with his brother Roy. Hang on. At Park School, Walt played. Yeah, that would be played, wouldn't it? Yeah, sorry. Walt played. At Park School, Walt played Peter Pan with his brother Roy, manning a block and lackle, which the rope wrapped around. And as Walt recalled, I flew right into the faces of the surprising odds. I flew right into the faces. As Walt recalls, As Walt recalled, I flew right into the faces of the surprised audience. Also adding that he was more realistic than Maud Adams in the end of his performance. He also added that he was more realistic than Maud Adams oh my god, I almost had it. And also added that he was more realistic than Maud Adams. And also added that he was more realistic than Maud Adams in the end of his performance. In 1924, Walt saw a silent film that captured his imagination. In 1935, years before the film would begin production, Walt wanted to bring another children's story to life, and Peter Pan was one of several stories considered. He expressed interest in making Peter Pan as his second film, following Snow White. This is really interesting because, as we know from doing the podcast, his intent was for Bambi to be next, and once again we're looking here at another timeline where Peter Pan could have come second, and that could have been a financial and so it's a really interesting thing to think about here that there is other possibilities that there's a lot of possibilities here that Snow White could have been first, then it could have been Peter Pan. Oh wait, no, it could have been Bambi second. So it's really interesting to see that Pinocchio was never meant to be the second one. However, what stopped Walt from being able to do this was that he could not get the rights until 4 years later, after he came to an agreement with the Great Ormond Street Hospital in London, for whom Barry had bequeathed the rights to. The studio started the story development and the character designs in the late 1930s and early 1940s, and intended to be his fourth film after Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, Bambi and Pinocchio, which we know Bambi was later put on hold for a short while for technical difficulties, and would end up becoming his fifth film, as we know. As we know, it was Snow White, Pinocchio, Fantasia, Dumbo, Bambi. So it's really interesting to see that was never the intent. That the original order that he envisioned was Snow White, Bambi, Pinocchio, then Peter Pan. Which is a really interesting thing to think about, is if the war hadn't happened, if the rights, there's a really interesting thing of here of this could have been the original beginnings of Walt Disney, the Walt Disney Company, and earlier drafts of these films could have come to life. During this time, Disney explored many possibilities of how the story could be interpreted. In the earliest version of the story, the film started by telling the audience the backstory of Peter Pan. However, on May 20th, 1940, during a story meeting, Disney said, "We ought to get right into the story itself, where Peter Pan comes to the house to get his shadow. That's where the story picks up. How Peter came to be is really another story. Something that other writers and creators would come up with in other iterations of the show." What's interesting is that this idea and concept of how Peter Pan came to Neverland and the origins of Peter Pan obviously are quite darker in the original source material, and some shows like Once Upon a Time would delve into this a bit more darker side of Peter Pan, which we're going to touch upon later on in the legacy section. But it's a really interesting thing to think about here, that there was ideas and concepts of this story being, how did Peter Pan become Peter Pan? However, what is here is this story. The story is about the children in Peter Pan, not. So it's a really interesting thing to think about, in that you could have had this film where it's much more of an origin story to then do the Peter Pan story that we all know and love as its sequel. Could have been really unique and interesting. Walt also explored opening the film in Neverland and Peter Pan coming to Wendy's house to kidnap her as her mother for the Lost Boys. Eventually, Disney decided that as I've just mentioned, another Walt explored opening the film in Neverland and Peter Pan coming to Wendy's house to kidnap her as a mother for his Lost Boys. Eventually, Disney decided that the kidnapping was far too dark and returned to Barry's original play. Where Peter comes to collect his shadow, and Wendy is eager to see Neverland. The scene in the nursery went through many alterations. For instance, in one version, it was Mrs. Darling who found Peter Pan's shadow and showed it to Mr. Darling, as in the original play. In another version of the script, Nana went to Neverland with Pete. In another version of the film, Nana went to Neverland with Peter and the Darlings, and the story was told through her eyes. Interesting. And that could have been. I'd love to see somebody do that, because that's actually quite an interesting concept and could have been something. Well, obviously, the next film is all about dogs, Lady and the Tramp. So maybe this was like the beginning of developing that at the same time. We'll find out next week when we dive into Lady and the Tramp. But that's an interesting thing to think about, that there was this idea that the film was being told through her eyes. would have been interesting. In other interpretations of the story, John Darling was left behind for being. In other interpretations of the story, John was left behind for being too serious, practical, and boring. The film also included Wendy looking for her Peter Pan's picture book. No. The film also included Wendy taking her Peter Pan picture book and Peter and the children eating with an imaginary dinner. At one point, there was a party at Peter's hideout. At one point, there was a party in Peter's hideout where Tinkerbell got humiliated and, in her anger, went and deliberately told Captain Hook the location of Peter Pan's hideout at her own free will. However, Walt felt that this was against Tinkerbell's character. And that she had gone too far and changed it to Captain Hook kidnapping and persuading Tinkerbell to tell him, which I think just brings so much more malice and manipulation to Captain Hook that I think would have been lost if this hadn't been the case. Yes, it would give Tinkerbell a bit more nuance and give this really darker edge that she gets in some other adaptations of the story. I do think the story that we were telling here, it made more sense for him to kidnap her. There is a point to Barry's play where Captain Hook puts poison in Peter's dose of medicine, and Tinkerbell saves Peter by drinking the poison herself, only to be revived by the applause of the theatre audience. After much debate, Disney discarded this fee. After much debate, Disney discarded this idea, as it would be too difficult to achieve on film. Disney would, however, use this concept for Walt Disney's World on Ice, Peter Pan, in 1989. In earlier scripts, there were more scenes involving the pirates and the mermaids. That was similar to what Disney had previously done with the Seven Dwarfs in Snow White. Ultimately, these scenes were cut for pacing reasons. The film was also a bit darker. The film was also a little bit darker at one point, since there was scenes involving Captain Hook being killed by the crocodile, the Darling family mourning over their lost children, and Pan and the children discovering the pirates' treasure, which is loaded with booby traps. Then on December 7th, 1941, the United States joined the Second World War, and as we all know from the package films, the World War II began. The following day, the US military took control of the studio and commissioned them to produce war propaganda films. They also forced Peter Pan as well. They also forced Peter Pan as well as Alice in Wonderland, The Adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad, Song of the South. Might have been for the best, that one. Fun and Fancy 3, among others, to be put on hold. After the war ended in 1945, the studio was in debt and they could only produce package films to support themselves. It was not until 1947, as the studio's financial health started to improve again, that the actual production of Peter Pan that the actual production of Peter Pan commenced. Wow. Even though Roy or Disney did not think Peter Pan, even though Roy did not think that Peter Pan would have much box office appeal. Rumor has it that Tinkerbell's design was based on Marilyn Monroe, but in reality her design was based on Tinkerbell's live-action reference model, Margaret Kerry. Margaret Kerry posed for reference film shots. On a soundstage, the footage was later used by supervisors. On a soundstage, the footage was later used by supervising Tinkerbell animator Mark Davis and his team when they drew the character. Kerry also provided the voice of the red-headed mermaid in the film. Like Kerry, Bobby Driscoll was both the live-action reference model, mainly used for the close-up scenes, and the voice actor for Peter Pan. Peter's flying and action reference shots, however, were provided by dancer and choreographer Roland Dupree. In an interview, she said she had to hold out her arms and pretend to fly for all the scenes requiring it. Catherine Beaumont, the voice of Wendy, also performed for the live-action reference footage. Similarly, Hans Conrad, the voice of both Captain Hook and Mr. Darling, was the live-action reference footage for both of these characters. Right. In contrast to rotoscoping, the animators did not merely trace the live-action footage, for this would make the animation look stiff and unnatural. Instead, the animators used it as a guide for animating by studying the human movement in the situation required. For example, how far does the head turn when a character looks over his shoulder? Milt Kahr, the supervising animator of Peter Pan and the Darling Children, claimed that the hardest thing to animate was a character floating in midair. Peter Pan got many positive reviews from critics and currently holds a 77% fresh rating on Rotten Tomatoes, based on 39 reviews. The New York Times gave the film a mixed review, praising the animation itself, but also declaring that the film was not really true. That the film was not really true to the spirit of the original Barry play. However, Times Magazine gave the film a highly favorable review, making no reference to the changes from the original play. The controversies of the differences between the play and the film, as we discussed last week with Alice in Wonderland, with there being a lot of differences from the book and the Disney film, they were short-lived, and today Peter Pan is considered one of Disney's animated classics. There is another controversy that spawned in recent years over the portrayal of the Indians, which is considered racially stereotypical, which is understandable, because you've got to remember that these films were created in a very different time period to the time period that we're in now, and the way that we view and express people is very different to how they were being portrayed, expressed, and viewed in the 1940s and 50s. So it's understandable that the way in which they are perceived and the terms used are outdated, and Disney understands that. And I think we've got to understand that too, is that these are a product of their times, and yes, it is uncomfortable at times, but you've got to remember that these films were never meant to cause harm or stereotype. And ultimately, you cannot watch Peter Pan on. So I get it, but you've got to remember in context when it comes to this film a bit as well, when it comes to these outdated remarks, because these the way that they are perceived are not how these people are perceived. The film is considered the most commercial. The film is considered the most commercial Disney movie to date, having a theatrical sequel and 6 Tinkerbell spin-off films, as well as a popular children's program on Disney Junior, as well as the live-action film. The plot. In the Edwardian London neighbourhood of Bloomsbury, in 1904, George and Mary Darling's preparations to attend a party are disrupted by the antics of their boys, John and Michael, acting out a story about Peter Pan and the pirates. But we're told of Peter Pan and the pirates that were told to them by their older sister Wendy. Their father angrily declares that Wendy has gotten too old to continue staying in the nursery with them, and it's time for her to grow up, much to everyone's shock. When George Darling begins to storm out the room, he trips over Nana. Both Nana and George fall, but the rest of the family only comforts Nana. George is shocked and jealous, and this causes Nana to be put in the doghouse. Nana is heartbroken as she never sleeps in the doghouse. George feels sympathy for Nana, but claims the children are not puppies, and Nana is truly a dog. When George and Mary leave for the party, Mary asks if the children will be okay without Nana. Because Wendy mentioned capturing Peter Pan's shadow the previous night at the window, George calls the whole thing ridiculous and tells his wife that she's as bad as the children are, and that it's no wonder that Wendy is getting crazy ideas. Little bit of gaslighting. You can understand why nobody likes George Darling. That night, they are visited in the nursery by Peter Pan himself. Wendy is awakened when Peter is trying to get his shadow on. Wendy offers to sew it on for him as he is trying to reattach it with a bar of soap. Though, through conversation, Wendy learns that Peter likes to hear her stories. However, when Peter learns that she is to grow up the next day, Peter offers to take her to Neverland, when she would never grow up. There, she could be the mother of the boys who live there. Wendy tries to kiss Peter out of gratitude. But Tinkerbell, who is jealous, pulls Wendy's hair. By this time, Michael and John awaken and are allowed to go with them. Peter sprinkles the three with pixie dust, and after a few false tries, they are able to fly by thinking happy thoughts. Whilst flying to Neverland, Michael grabs Tinkerbell from the windowsill and pours some pixie dust on Nana on her back, causing her to fly, but gets caught by the rope as she waves goodbye to Michael as they fly away. They land on one of Big Ben's clock arrows. showing Wendy the way to the second star. Showing Wendy the way to the second star to the right. Peter then takes them to the island of Neverland. A ship of pirates is anchored off Neverland, commanded by Captain Hook, with his first mate, Mr. Smee. Hook boldly plots to take revenge upon Peter Pan for cutting off his hand. Captain Hook laments Peter Pan's role in causing Tick-Tock the crocodile to follow him due to Peter cutting off Hook's left hand and throwing it to the crocodile. Tick-Tock found it so delicious he follows him everywhere for another taste. Tick-Tock suddenly shows up next to the ship. Hook hears the clock ticking, and his eyebrows and pointing mustache begin twitching in rhythm with the music of Never Smile at a Crocodile. The crocodile's eyes begin popping up to the tune, sending Hook into a panic. The crocodile then emerges from the water onto a rock, rubbing his belly and licking his lips, accompanied by a wild smile towards the captain. Hook then screams for Mr. Smee to save him, and Smee shoos off the crocodile. The crocodile then frowns and wriggles his tail to the ticking clock while sulking away. The crew's resilience is interrupted by the arrival of Peter and the Darlings. The children easily evade them, and despite a trick by jealous Tinkerbell to have Wendy killed, they meet up with the Lost Boys. 6 lads in animal pajamas, who look to Peter as their leader. John and Michael set off with the Lost Boys to find the island's Indians, who instead capture them, believing them responsible for taking the chief's daughter, Tiger Lily. Meanwhile, Peter takes Wendy to see the mermaids, where they see that Hook and Smee have captured Tiger Lily to coerce her into revealing Peter's hideout. Peter duels Hook and have the crocodile chase him away. As Peter crows in triumph, Wendy reminds him of Tiger Lily, and he rescues the princess. Peter is honored by the tribe. Eventually, Wendy tells her brothers and the Lost Boys about the real world and having a mother, at which Peter believes they are leaving to grow up, never to come back. Meanwhile, Hook plots to take advantage of Tinkerbell's jealousy of Wendy, tricking her into revealing the location of Peter's lair. The pirates lie in wait and capture the Lost Boys and the Darlings as they exit, leaving behind a time bomb to kill Peter. Tinkerbell, learning of the plot just in time to snatch the bomb from Peter as it explodes. However, although Peter survives the explosion, Tinkerbell is fatally injured in the now ruined Hangman's Tree. Peter tries to find and rescue Tinkerbell, while debris fall in the process as he can see her light. However, more debris fall on Peter off screen. Peter then rescues Tinkerbell from the rubble, and together they confront the pirates, releasing the children before they can be forced to walk the plank. Peter engages Hook in single combat as the children fight off the crew and humiliate the captain. Peter fights Hook in a final showdown until the pirate begs for mercy. Peter then allows Hook to leave and never return. He crowds, and Hook lunges at him from behind. Wendy warns Peter, and he ducks, while Hook falls into the water below, where the crocodile was waiting. Hook and his crew flee, with the crocodile in hot pursuit. Peter gallantly commands commands the deserted ship, and with the aid of Tinker Bell's pixie dust, flies it to London with the children aboard. Mr. and Mrs. Darling return home from the party to find Wendy not in her bed, but sleeping at the open window. John and Michael are asleep in their beds. Wendy wakes and excitedly tells them about their adventures. The parents look out the window and see what appears to be a pirate ship in the clouds. Mr. Darling, who has softened his position about Wendy staying in the nursery, recognizes the ship from his own childhood and realizes that some childhood fantasies may be real after all. The foursome all watch happily as it breaks up into the clouds itself. When it comes to Peter Pan, there's quite a chunk of legacy that it has left in its work. And I've already touched upon a few of these, with it having a sequel, Return to Neverland, in 2003. Peter Pan and many of Peter Pan's characters all appear across the House of the Mouse. The story of Peter Pan is a very big part of ABC's Once Upon a Time, with Captain Hook being the main character from the second season, Peter Pan being the main villain of the first half of season 3. So it had a very big cemented legacy there. It also stems into the Descendants, with Captain Hook having a son in those, and having Jake and the Neverland Pirates, and the Tinkerbell films. So there's so much media that has come out of Peter Pan. Which I just find so interesting and unique to think about, that there's a real broad of things. There's a real broad consensus of there's something for everyone from Peter Pan, which I find really interesting for adults, younger kids, teens. So, and in all, it's got a really cemented legacy that is still loved today. As with many characters, Peter Pan, Captain Hook, Tinkerbell, Wendy are all featured in Kingdom Hearts across the entire saga, of with Captain Hook being a villain in it. Peter Pan is also in Epic Mickey, Power of Illusion. Captain Hook has a role in that too. So when it comes to video games, there's a wide breadth of the ways that Peter Pan is included within these. Tinkerbell was a playable character in Disney Infinity 2.0. Peter Pan was a planned character for Disney Infinity 3.0 before its cancellation. There was many power discs and attractions and that you could attain throughout Disney Infinity. The characters are all playable in Disney's Magic Kingdoms. So when it comes to video games, there's a vast array of characters and ways that these characters are used within these games. When it comes to Disney parks, Peter Pan, Captain Hook, Wendy, Tinkerbell, and Mr. Smee are all meetable characters across the parks. Peter Pan's flight since 1955 has been in Disneyland, Disney World, Disneyland Paris. It's a main attraction across many of the parks. You can see Captain Hook in many of the Halloween parades, Halloween shows. Peter Pan and Wendy are always around during parades and meet and greets. So it's very easily to be able to meet and greet with them. They're also across the cruise line ships with the Pirates Nights. And that's just cements a real big legacy for Peter Pan. And I know a lot of Disney creators and fans that I know and consider friends adore Peter Pan and love this character, and that's what's really cemented a legacy, that a breadth of young fans that are now adults still have this real sense of hope and love of never being able to grow up. And in a sense, Disney is that for a lot of adults that adore magic, that they're never going to grow up because they still adore and love this. And ultimately, that's what Peter Pan story is all about. It's about, yes, you have to grow up, you don't have to lose that innocence, you don't have to lose that magic and childhood just because you're growing up. And I think Peter Pan and Disney in general go hand in hand with that. Jay and Barry didn't realise that at the time, but ultimately they have the same sentiments of being able to still be that child at heart, even though you have to grow up and be within the world. And that's where I'm going to end this week's podcast. As always, you can follow me on Instagram at StrategyDisneyPod, and you can email me your thoughts at strategydisneypod@gmail.com. Drop in the comments your thoughts on Peter Pan, and see you next week for Lady and the Tramp. Bye!